Welcome to the Common Good Podcast, a conversation about the significance of place, eliminating economic isolation, and the structure of belonging. My name is Joey Taylor, and in this episode, I speak with Dr. Martin Accad. Martin is the current director of Action Research Associates, and he teaches classes at both Arab Baptist Theological Seminary and the Near East School of Theology in Beirut. When I first met Martin, he was my professor, and then he supervised my practicum before eventually finding a job for me working with him in Beirut. In this job, Martin and I would often drive to different locations around the country. And as I think about that time in my life, one particular drive sticks out to me. I remember driving over the mountains from Beirut to the Accad Valley on this incredibly dangerous road, littered with potholes and driving hazard where nobody obeyed traffic laws. And as we summited, I remember Martin pointing out a group of Bedouins as he began talking about what he called a theology of staying. This idea that builds on incarnational theology, which is the root of a lot of Christian activism. My experience living in Lebanon was encapsulated in this moment. Incredible beauty, ideas and relationships that would forever shape my life, and a tangible sense of uncertainty and structural disintegration. This theology of staying became the subject of a blog post you can find in the show notes, and since we started this podcast over 5 years ago, I've wanted to talk to Martin about this perspective. And then I more recently learned that he's been doing urban beekeeping in Beirut, and I thought, these two subjects, keeping bees and a theology of staying, would be a really interesting conversation. But as we began, I knew right away it wasn't going to be what I expected. I started the conversation by asking Martin what he loves about his country, and this is what he said.
The image of the importance of staying over the years has kind of collapsed. My world has collapsed. It's very hard to find things to love anymore in Lebanon. I think probably what I value most is still relationships. I'm much more aware and conscious, I think and hope, than I was when I was younger, when I was more of an idealist. When you're confident that you have a clear calling about staying, and then you start asking yourself, I think later in life, how much is this about others and how much is it really about myself, and about feeling good, about thinking that you are helping others. And so it's this sort of Messiah mentality, this savior complex. And I think I'm much more conscious today that I want to avoid the savior complex being a driving force of my life. And that's not easy because I was born in a pastor's home, and it's not easy to get rid of the savior's complex when you're born in a pastor's home. But there's so much to hate about Lebanon. The prices are going up every day. I live in the center of Beirut where my children go to school, and we can barely breathe anymore because of all the fumes of the generators. Because, of course, when the government doesn't give electricity, then you have all the neighborhood generators and the building generators that are activated all the time, 24/7. Of course, collectively 24/7. Individually, no building can anymore afford 24/7 electricity. So, we get about 11 or 12 hours of electricity every 24 now from our building generator, because as people living in that building, that's really what we can afford. The price of gas has gone up so much. There's no more subsidies from the government. So you have to adjust to what the majority are able to afford. So these sorts of daily challenges, daily struggles are really hard. All prices in supermarkets are now in US dollars because that's the only way that businesses can stay in the business. The roads are dark because there are very few lights that are still functioning. Traffic lights are mostly out of function, so you have to be very alert when you're driving. It's really a country that has disintegrated. And I think the hardest in all of this is that we don't see any light at the end of the tunnel, because the problem is not really the economy. The problem is a political problem. And we have a whole political structure that has been abusive and that functions like a cartel system. The country, in every money generating department of the state, is like a cake that's divided between six main individuals that represent also their base. So it's this cartel system where, if you're part of a group from those, then you get services in exchange for loyalty. In fact, I think a minister or a member of parliament in Lebanon have very little power. I'm convinced now that it has mostly been a facade for most of Lebanon's history. They're really just a facade for a few individuals who have transitioned from being warlords during our civil war period and then into the 1990s became the political actors and have transferred all of the sickness of war and conflict into the political system and completely destroyed all institutions. But even there, those cartels are having increasing difficulty surviving and maintaining the system because of the economic collapse and the collapse of the whole banking system and the financial system. So I've just told you about everything that is to hate in Lebanon. In the midst of that, I guess it's the relationships that are still meaningful. There's a sense of solidarity also, where, again, you have to be careful that you're not cultivating the Messiah complex, but you want to be with others and form a supportive system that is able to resist in the face of this collapse. Of course, Lebanon is a beautiful country, and the nature is still what it is when you get out of the city and you can find it.
I reread this article yesterday, and the tone of the article and your tone are pretty different. So one of the things that you said in that article that I think is worth mentioning is that, I don't know what the stats are now, but 3 times the amount of Lebanese live outside of the country as do inside the country. And so this has been a trend that's been happening for a while, that people very often who can leave the country. I mean, the way that you frame it in the article is the people who stay for a cause. And so the cause that you're talking about now can be tinged with some of that savior complex. But I wonder if you could articulate, what is the cause that you're staying for now? Why do you continue to remain in a country that's so broken right now?
I think it's a form of resistance. Resistance is a big word in Lebanon because it's the word used by groups that have destroyed the country, ambitions that go beyond the borders. But for me, it's a form of resistance. Somewhere deep inside, I just don't want to leave because it means that those corrupt people have won. I think that's quite a strong factor, but also the sense of solidarity, as I mentioned. I don't think we've seen poverty before the way we're seeing it now. There are grown-up men who cry because they can't put food on the table. That's very, very tough to see. There are people who are gravely ill, either physically or psychologically, who cannot afford their medication and grow worse and worse. I grew up through the Civil War, and I've developed, I think, a fighting mentality and a mentality of resistance, and I don't want to give up. I have to keep this in check a little bit, and my wife is not Lebanese. I mean, she has developed that sense a little bit, I'm afraid, but we need to make sure about our motivations, that they remain morally acceptable, that it's not all reactionary, and that it's not coming out of a sense of bitterness. And I think that's something that we have to constantly be vigilant about, and that we keep a positive, and I'm not talking about, just positive thinking, but we need to keep motives and a heart that is not becoming hardened. So it's not out of bitterness and a hard heart that we are still here. We want it to be out of compassion, out of love, and out of a desire still to see change. I often used to say, the day I get to the conviction that I cannot be part of bringing change, then I would lose my sense of purpose. I think somewhere emotionally, I still feel that and I'm still very actively working towards change, both in terms of current political activism and working on the past, because I think one of the Lebanon's big problems is that we don't know how to deal with the past, and we're a nation and a people that are experts in forgetting and not remembering. So I'm very actively working towards change, but I increasingly have a hard time believing that change is possible, because I've grown in my understanding of the systemic problem that we have, and we're really not fighting natural, predictable problems. I think the economy of Lebanon would not be difficult to fix. Lebanon is such a small country comparatively with quite a small economy. So that's not the problem. The problem is a deep systemic corruption, this cartel system I've described, a structure that does things in a certain way, a political elite that will not let go. I mean, it's a fight to the death. I don't think that they will ever give up what they have, the system that they've built. So it's very hard to see how change can happen. I try to bring in my theology and to remind myself that macro level change, even though it's important, and I think it's important that the church would work towards it, it's not the ultimate purpose. The ultimate purpose is more the micro level change that you can still do around you and yourself, within your family, among your friends and neighbors. And you have to celebrate the small achievements, otherwise you can't survive in such a context.
Because I hear you talking about resistance and maintaining a soft heart and maybe even a sense of hope that things can change at a micro level. How do you hold on to that in the midst of all of this?
I think by appreciating little things. I appreciate my wife, I appreciate my children, I appreciate friends who feel that they've lost any support system, and learning little lessons. For instance, I learned a small lesson, and I mean, you come suddenly to an awareness. Talking about the savior complex, you always think that when you're supporting someone, you're helping them. But I suddenly had a moment of understanding recently where I realized actually in the teaching of Jesus, you are not Jesus to those that you're supporting. They are Jesus. Because that's what Jesus says. He says, anytime you give a cup of cold water, or you're doing it to me. When you're visiting a prisoner, you're doing it to me. He doesn't tell us, do like me and help the poor, do like me and visit the prisoner, do like me and take a cup of water to those who are thirsty. He's saying, when you do it, you're doing it to me. And so I went to that friend recently and I said, actually, you have to stop viewing me as someone who you think is this great support system. Actually, you are Jesus to me, and you're an incredible gift to me because you are Jesus to me. It's a privilege to be in a position where there are so many Jesuses around us. We need to stop seeing ourselves like Jesus who is saving the world and realize that the world in need is Jesus, and we are called to be at his feet and learn from those small relationships and experiences. It's a blend of trust, but also of hope. You feel helpless every day, every moment, but I think the hope in the fact that the difficulties of everyday life are not the sum total of life. In fact, they're very marginal to life. Life is much more about relationships. I don't know that you can live in circumstances like this without the theology of hope. There's no reason why one would want to or be able to. There's nothing natural about this way of living, about living in a context like Lebanon. In a way, everything that's around us is something we've constructed by societies and individuals and systems. And we tend to get this sense of fake hope or optimism, fake joy that comes from a moment of well-being or a moment of wealth or health. But hope, I don't know if you can separate it from a definition of life. And life itself is hope. Life and hope are synonymous. That's why I think I find so much value in my closest relationships, my wife and my children, and those day-to-day relations around me. I can't separate hope from those small moments of life that really become everything and give meaning to your subsistence. And they give real joy. It's not sort of, that's all I have left. No, it's actually, that's what it was all about, and now I see it.
To what extent do you see yourself as being a part of the country that is breaking apart? And to what extent do you need to remove yourself a bit and say, actually, I'm an agent for change, even in micro ways, on this system that is so corrupt and broken?
I think it's crucial to continue to see ourselves as part of a system because we don't live in isolation. And when there is a parasite and when the system becomes ill, not only does it affect us, but somehow we've also been carriers. We've been part of a platform that has allowed for this parasite to grow and spread. It's when we realize that we are part of a system that we are able also to recognize the problem better, because it's not that far away from us. It's not far from our own story, our history, our memory, our past. It's not far from what we're experiencing every day. Yeah. At the same time, I think there is a sense of needing a certain amount of distance in order to have a prophetic perspective and a prophetic voice to bring in a vision that challenges the status quo.
Hope is a tricky thing to define and to possess. As I was listening to Martin talk about a theology of hope that can't be separated from life itself, I remembered a blessing written by Jan Richardson. Here it is. So may we know the hope that is not just for someday, but for this day. Here, now, and this moment that opens to us. Hope not made of wishes, but of substance. Hope made of sinew and muscle and bone. Hope that has breath and a beating heart. Hope that will not keep quiet and be polite. Hope that knows how to holler when it is called for. Hope that knows how to sing when there seems little cause. Hope that raises us from the dead. Not someday, but this day. Every day. Again and again and again. Now, as we return to the conversation, Martin begins talking about one way he's embodying resistance and hope: keeping bees.
It's a little initiative that's really side occupation. It's not lucrative at all. In order for it to become a break-even side business, we'd have to have about 3 times more bees than we currently have, or sell the honey for 3 times more than we currently do. So that's a little bit the picture. Just to clear the fact that this is perhaps more about finding meaning and hope and life in the midst of all the remaining disintegration. And I'm beginning to develop an apicultural theology. So apiculture is beekeeping. And so, what can we learn from the beehive and from the bee and from this whole process? And it's fascinating. So bees are my friends.
Talk a little bit about what the practicalities of what beekeeping looks like.
So we're a little group of friends, and we do that together. It's easier when you're a small group because you're not always available to take care of your bees on a weekly basis, which is what you need to do during the season from March, April, all the way to September, October. You can't administer nature the way that suits you. The bees don't wait for you. They've got their thing going, and whether you're there or not. And so we do urban beekeeping. I think we're probably the only current and ongoing project of urban beekeeping in Lebanon. We use methods that are different from the traditional ways that Lebanese have done or do beekeeping, which is to take the beehive to the mountain in the summer and to the coast in the winter. We actually have a collection of about 10 beehives in different locations. We currently have about 30 beehives, and we're going to start this new season with about 60 beehives or 65 beehives. There's the life of the beehive itself, which is fascinating and worth reflecting on. There's the beehive's relationship with the beekeeper, and then there's the beehive's relationship with its environment, in our case with the urban environment. And so where there's so much destruction, so much dirt, so much darkness, so much pollution. Somehow bees are able to manage their way through all of this mess and produce this delicious product, which we then test in the laboratory and find is of an amazing quality. I don't know how they negotiate their way through the human mess of the urban environment, but somehow they do.
I read that most bees live their lives within a mile of the central hive. So their entire lives are kind of focused around this one particular area. And they pull from that local context in order to make this honey.
They work within a 3 kilometer radius, so that's about 2 mile radius. So you could probably have about 30 beehives within a 2 mile radius. But if you want to start another one, then you have to go beyond those 2 mile radius, because otherwise there wouldn't be enough food. And you would also destroy a lot of other pollinators and cause a disbalance in the ecosystem, because the bees that produce honey are domestic bees. And the domestic bee is such an aggressive collector of nectar and pollen that other pollinators cannot survive if there are too many bees in a dense environment. We know that without bees, our planet would not survive, because all of the pollination is the result of pollinizing insects, and the domestic bee is the most effective pollinizer. There was a time when there was all these fears about the death of the domestic bee and other pollinizers because of fertilizers and all of that. So you had so much urban beekeeping that happened in Europe, for instance, that it became a danger to the ecosystem, because they don't attack other bees, but they're collecting so much that they don't leave anything else for anyone else. So that can end up being harmful for the environment. So as with everything in farming or caring for animals or insects, you have to do it in a way that's responsible and knowledgeable. Otherwise, you can cause environmental disasters.
When you go from one hive to the next, from different neighborhoods, can you tell the difference in the honey? Can you taste the difference?
Oh, yes, of course, because, I mean, some urban environments are similar. It's the same kinds of flowers or trees that are in the same neighborhood, then you're going to get the same kind of honey. But if you get a little bit outside the city center and go a little bit more into greater Beirut, you start having some oak and other kinds of plants and flowers that you can taste in the honey. You also have different levels of humidity in different locations, and the honey has to be at a certain level of humidity in order to avoid fermentation or crystallization. And the bees know that better than any lab. And once the honey reaches the right level of humidity, this is when they seal the honeycomb with wax, and so you know that it's ready to be collected. All of this is quite fascinating. I think there are lessons about good stewardship in beekeeping. We have to remember that bees, just like cows or other domesticated animals, they're not producing food for you. They're producing it for themselves. They're producing it for their little ones. The bees are hoarding. The domestic bee is one of the most effective hoarders. What the beehive is doing is it's collecting food for the winter. That's all it's doing. And so it collects pollen, which is their protein, and it collects nectar and makes honey, which is the carbohydrates. And then that's how they continue to survive. And so you cannot be greedy when you're doing beekeeping. You have to learn good stewardship. But you have also, if you want good quality honey, you can't be greedy, because when you get to preparing for winter, many beekeepers will put artificial substances or water and sugar for the bees to survive the winter. Now, if you want to do it right and preserve the quality of your honey, you have to resist that, and you have to leave enough honey and pollen within the beehive for the hive to be able to survive the winter. And so what we're doing is we have to receive these gifts from the beehive with gratitude and have a mentality of sharing. They are sharing with us, probably not very willingly, as we would find out if we went in without proper protection gear. But this is how nature works. And so I think if we resist the urge to be greedy, if we resist the urge for hyper-consumerism and materialism, then we're able to share those gifts with those little gift givers and coexist with them in a healthy way and in a responsible way.
I know a lot of the work that you're doing in your life in general is about cultivating and instilling a sense of the common good in Lebanon. And I wonder, as you reflect on the work of the bees that you're keeping, how would you, in light of that work, define the common good?
I think probably bees give us some of the best lessons about the common good. Research increasingly shows that the beehive is a united organism. So we can't think of the beehive as a collection of individual bees. One bee alone could do nothing. It functions as one organism with incredible diversity of functions with the one purpose of continuing life. And I think that's an incredible painting and reflection of the common good. In a mature beehive, you have primarily the largest proportion of bees are female workers. You might have maybe 30 or 40,000 female bees, and you might have about 500 males that are not very useful, as maybe often society also reflects that. And then you have one bee, which people have usually called the queen bee, but in reality, this one bee is the egg layer. So all she does is to lay eggs and ensure the continuity of the beehive. She doesn't command anybody. She doesn't order anyone around. She doesn't lead the action. In fact, the purpose of all the other bees are to make sure that she can continue her function of laying eggs. Every female bee, working bee, lives about 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. So the majority of the beehive lives 4 to 6 weeks. So it's constantly reproducing. And it gives it this incredible agility because the queen bee or the egg-laying bee adjusts the size of her beehive based on the availability of food, based on the temperature and the ability to survive in the environment. And in the winter, you see that the beehive shrinks dramatically in number and is able to survive the winter. And as soon as the flowers begin to come out again in the spring, the beehive grows again in numbers, simply because the egg-laying bee decides to lay more eggs. But then during those 4 to 6 weeks of life, the bee comes out immediately from its little hexagonal cubby, and it gets to work immediately. For the first few days, it's able to produce wax. She's the architect and the builder inside the beehive for a few days. And then she moves to other functions in the next phase. First, inside the beehive. So she's going to contribute in preserving a certain level of humidity and temperature within the beehive. Then it's going to have a function at the door of the beehive, and she's going to be a guardian, and she's going to defend the beehive against potential danger or aggressors. Then she's going to go and start collecting nectar and pollen. Then she's going to become a nurse, and she's going to come back inside the beehive and feed the larvae. So at every season of her life, that short life of 6 weeks, she's going to play different functions. And this organism altogether is what allows subsistence and this common good that they create together. And somehow they have all the knowledge and skill needed from the moment they peek their antennas out of that little cubby, and they start with those functions. It's almost like you have a collective brain or intuition that allows this to continue. What better picture of the common good, where everyone works together, different functions with a common goal, caring for one another for the continuation of life.
Thanks for listening. Check the show notes for more info about Martin, Action Research Associates, Urban Bees Beirut, and a Theology of Staying. This episode has been hosted and produced by me, Joey Taylor, and the music is from Jeff Gorman.